often been mislabeled as the Second War for American Independence. The War of 1812, which was fought between the years 1812 and 1815 between the belligerent countries of the United States of America and Great Britain, was a war that was controversial in its time and largely forgotten to this day. It began on two frontiers. The first frontier was the American frontier, west of the Appalachian Mountains. British outposts were allegedly supporting native tribes, giving them food, guns, ammunition to fight the American settlers who were moving westward. On the second frontier, the Atlantic Ocean, American shipping was at risk. The British government was forcing American merchantmen to sail into British ports to be taxed on all of their goods, even if they weren't doing trade with the British Empire. At this time, there was a war raging on the European continent. It was between a coalition of nations and Napoleon Bonaparte's France. Great Britain had been embroiled in this war since the 1790s, and it had been a long and costly affair for all nations involved. Across the Atlantic, it impacted the United States, as the great ally of the United States was France. If it were not for France, we would not be a free and independent nation from Great Britain. But with the beheading of Louis XVI and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, this great alliance was on shaky legs. Still, the Americans were trading with the French, and this did not sit well with the British. This was too much for some in the United States, mainly war hawks like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. And in June of 1812, for the first time in its history, the United States will declare war on a foreign nation. The United States military forces, the Navy, the Army, they were ill-prepared to go to war with the world's greatest empire. By late 1812, excursions into Canada, where Americans were trying to break Canada away from the tyranny, as they saw it, of Great Britain. Americans will push into Canada with mixed results. The war will expand out onto the oceans. Earning its nickname, Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution will score its first victory during the War of 1812. Other American frigates will also bring home prizes and victories, much needed to keep the war going at home. But back across the Atlantic, things are starting to change during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon has come to grief in Russia. This will give a free hand to Great Britain to start paying attention to the pesky Americans back across the Atlantic. Thus, 30,000 British soldiers will be landed in Canada. Warships will end up off of American waters. The British will then, in 1814, land a force south of Washington, D.C., and capture and burn the United States Capitol. At the Battle of Baltimore, they will be turned back at Fort McHenry and will be given our Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. The British will then turn to the Deep South, along the Gulf Coast, where they will fight at places like Pensacola, Mobile, and eventually at New Orleans, where an up-and-coming general named Andrew Jackson will bring home a victory in January of 1815, which 13 years later will propel him to the White House. Shortly after New Orleans, the Treaty of Ghent, which will end the War of 1812, is signed. Both sides will essentially go back to status quo antebellum. The British will hold on to Canada, the Americans will have their land holdings, and some improved fishing rights. Although much of the war was poorly prosecuted on the American side, there were enough victories to instill a sense of patriotism and pride. Perhaps the longest lasting legacy to come from the War of 1812 is our Star-Spangled Banner. While most Americans can't name a single battle from the War of 1812, they do know the words to our national anthem.